Good evening, I'm Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board. This is the meeting of the Select Board for, what is today's date, Wednesday, May 24th. Let's start off with any updates or comments from the Select Board.
Got one here.
John.
Don't mind. So there has been brought to the attention of town meeting members and to the select board a newsletter recently. Our town administrator commented on it, and I think others may have commented on it or will want to comment on it. It was from something. It was under the title of Black and Brown News, and frankly, I don't know how else to describe the contents except to use words like scurrilous and also hate-filled. And there is no place in Brookline for the content such as was represented in that newsletter. And I think there is no place in Brookline for those who authored the newsletter to somewhat mockingly appear before us at our previous meetings, public comment segment, under what seemed to be assumed names, to essentially assert their innocence and the innocence of any other organization that might be assumed to be affiliated because of the similarity of names. And frankly, we need to get to the bottom of those connections. But there is no doubt about the hate, excuse me, the racist hate language that was used in the newsletter. And there is no doubt that individuals were targeted by that language who were essentially smeared and subjected to the worst kind of insults, and for no good reason. These are some of the most respectable of Brookline's activists, town meeting members, contributors to the well-being of the town. Several of them were named, their faces were put behind bars. A racist term was used to apply to them. I'm going to mention one in particular because the two of us had a conversation today, and I promised her I would say these words tonight. So Deborah Brown, I hope you're listening. In no world did you deserve the treatment that was accorded to you in this newsletter. And in no world did the other people who were treated to the same treatment deserve that. And this is not ended. There's going to have to be a determination made as to the true source of the language that was used, the hate. And then because Brookline is a town where there is no place for hate, we're going to have to do something about it. I don't want to leave the impression anywhere that because some time has passed, nothing is going to be done about this. It's going to take time for something to be done about it, but something will be done about it. And there will be no reward for certain for any individuals who participated in that. And I thank people for paying attention to these remarks tonight.
Any other comments? I would just like to add, while I agree with Don in terms of the characterization of the newsletter, using words that I've only heard deep in the South by racist whites, including the American Nazi Party, it's actually a experience I had. Still, I think we have to be very careful not to give them too much oxygen, because that's really what they're looking for. An opportunity to sort of disrupt and get us worked up over their hateful language. And while we have to be very clear that we do not accept that their language or their tactics, we just need to be very careful not to give them too much oxygen to continue. That's all I heard. Okay, anything else? Public comment.
Oh, you don't want me to read that?
Right. Tell people what.
I
the
could
rules are.
not sign on with my laptop tonight, and so I do not have the script in front of me. Devin, do you happen to have it for me? Would you like to read it?
I don't have it in front of me,
Okay,
but the gist of it is,
the gist of it is, people should, this is a time allotted for public comment. We invite the public to make use of this time. We ask them to observe some common sense rules, which is to, as much as possible, be polite. We do not engage in personal attacks, do not speak of personnel. And you'll have 3 minutes. Devin will give you a very polite time cue to let you know when your time is up. And if you have come tonight to make public comment, you're welcome to it. But if you are not here tonight or not participating in this meeting tonight remotely, you can still make public comment via email. And you can send that to this board as a whole, or you can communicate with individual members, and their addresses are on the Brookline Select Board website. And I hope I covered everything. Devin, do we have people for public comment?
the first person signed up for public comment is Mariah Obrega. Mariah, you've been promoted to a panelist. You can unmute and your 3 minutes will begin.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon. Mariah Nobrega. I'm the school committee finance chair. I'm speaking to you tonight regarding the settlement of collective bargaining obligations related to the public safety contract that was recently decided by the JLMC. It is my understanding, based on conversations I've had, including the conversation we had at the last town school partnership committee, that tonight you'll be voting to at least partially fund the larger than anticipated settlement costs using revised state aid that would flow entirely to the town outside of the town school partnership. First off, I want to say that I appreciate that you have an unanticipated expense that you are seeking to find resolution for. And I actually have one question and several comments. I'm going to ask my question and just hope for an answer, and let me know if you won't answer it. I'll go on to my comments. My question is, I recall that there were several $1 million in free cash that weren't allocated this year. And I was wondering why the settlement costs, is there a reason that they can't be funded out of the free cash, the unallocated free cash?
Free cash is a one-time expense. We're looking to, as much as possible, to finance permanent costs.
Isn't the settlement also, the retroactive settlement also a one-time expense?
It's a one-time expense. We're settling that with ARPA, a combination of ARPA funds, which are also one-time from select board accounts that aren't fully exhausted, and the collective bargaining reserve.
Okay, thank you. My next question, or my comments are, so I understand that the select board is not seeking to set a precedent with this decision, and that there will be opportunities sought to restore the balance of funding throughout the year. And I endorse both of these decisions, particularly in light of the plan to update the town school partnership allocation formula over the summer. The right place for these conversations to occur is not unilaterally at the select board, but through and at the partnership meeting. And so I appreciate, again, not setting the precedent. Particularly the precedent of funding contract overages above the line is something that would need to be discussed. And I would note that PSB is currently negotiating the paraprofessional contract for 2023 to 2026. And if this were to set a precedent, PSB might itself find that it would, as the town is proposing, seek to fund portions that exceeded estimates above the line, as opposed to within the PSB allocation. And I think there's just a great potential for a sort of tragedy of the commons unfolding with this. And so we should be really thinking about this carefully through the town school partnership, and again, be discussing these decisions as part of the planned update of the allocation formula. Final comment, I want to share a quote from the coverage of last week's school committee meeting that was provided in select board member John Van Scoyak's newsletter that he sent today. As the closing paragraph of a long form piece on the meeting, Mr. Van Scoyak writes, outgoing BEU President Jessica Shubo told me later that the May 18th showcase of BEU demands won't be their last. Fasten your seatbelts. This type of statement does not help negotiations and is not productive, particularly in the context of that we were discussing tonight of how to fund contract settlements and overages, and particularly as Mr. Van Scoyak tonight may vote to shift funds away from PSB.
You have 30 seconds.
I'm all done. Thank you.
At this time, there are 11 virtual attendees and 1 in person. No one else is using the hand raise or Q&A feature to indicate they'd like to make a comment.
Okay, thank you, Devin. Next on the agenda is a question of approving, so we don't have minutes today. Since our last meeting was yesterday. So miscellaneous items. We have 3. Approving a request from Foolish Corner Merchants Association for a sidewalk occupancy permit. Accepting a donation from RPI Station Street LLC for the Brookline Commission for the Arts for an arts maintenance fund. And approving a temporary all alcohol beverages sales license to Lars Anderson for an annual car club dinner to be held on June 21st. Any questions about those miscellaneous items?
Thanks for that donation.
Yes, thank you for that donation. We've been getting quite a few, and we appreciate that. We appreciate all of them, and you know, there's a lot going to the Arts Commission and to do things that would be beneficial to the entire town. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, I move approval of those 3 items. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. John.
Aye.
Marion.
Aye.
John, I'm sorry, Mike.
Aye.
Paul.
Aye.
And chair votes aye.
We have to sit in a row.
Yeah. Right. That turn my head back and forth. Okay. Fine, next, MBTA's Community Act Opticals presentation. And we have 2
Recording in progress.
people from Opticals and Kara Bruton, who's gonna kick off the discussion.
Good evening. My name is Kara Bruton. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development. And with me tonight is Maria Morelli from the Planning Department, as well as 2 folks from Opticus Consultants. I'll just wait a second. Okay, so this is one of our monthly meetings to the Select Board. I think this is our 3rd update to the Select Board. These are going to get more exciting as we get closer and closer to our own zoning warrant article deadline of around Labor Day in order to comply with the state MBTA Communities Act regulations and guidelines by the end of the calendar year. Do it to the next slide, please. So for the Select Board, we have text that's over the graphic, but I will explain what this graphic says. What we've been doing is starting most of our presentations with kind of a big picture understanding that people are entering and finding out about both the state law as well as a variety of ideas of how to comply with that state law. In addition to work that was done, that was started before COVID. And so this kind of graphic just kind of centers all of us that we recognize that many people listening from home, especially, might be interested in, when are we going to hear back from the state about whether we can change some of the guidelines, or want to talk about the details of the state's compliance model. Other people want to focus on options beyond Harvard Street for us to comply with the state law. And then there's the Harvard Street study, which of course overlaps as one option for us to comply with the law. And Maria Morelli has been leading that since before COVID, when we met with all of the boards and committee members just before everything shut down. And we were talking about a cross-department study to look at barriers to multifamily housing. So that's when that kernel started. Here we are post-COVID, and now with a deadline, that Harvard Street study was completed by Maria as far as the analysis went, looking at what some of those blocks are. And that's posted on the town website that's up there. And what we are looking at tonight, if you can go to the next slide, is just the form-based code. So all of these things we are talking about at different meetings, but tonight we are just focused on form-based code, which kind of overlaps in a way for us to comply with the state law. We are proposing doing that on Harvard Street, But of course, they will talk about form-based code, which is kind of general as far as the introductory meeting. Okay, next slide. And I will just, this is a slide that we've updated every time we've seen you all at a select board meeting. So here we are, the green arrow, it's May 24th. In March 15th, we had something like 260 people at our kickoff virtual meeting for the Harvard Street community kickoff. In the last, since March, we've had, not we, I'm using the royal we, Maria Morelli has led single-handedly dozens of small meetings, site walks. She's been invited to neighborhood groups, Mothers Out Front, all kinds of different people, as well as have standing office hours. And that's been a helpful way for us to meet people where they're at, what they're interested in. More formally, we had our first select board update with you on March 28th. Where you all wrote the letter to the state asking some questions about guidelines. We have not received a response about that yet. I am in touch with Chris Buckman from DHCD. As recently as late last week, they recognize they're overdue in getting a response to us. They will. And once they do, they will follow up with the select board appointed MBTA compliance, options committee to kind of workshop or further understand whatever the state response is.
Can I ask a question? He's just been appointed, but have we been in touch with, or are we planning to be in touch with the new housing secretary?
I have not thought about doing that. I'd be happy to talk with Town Administrator Carey about the best way we might try to
Yeah,
go down that as well.
we don't know how to approach you, but
Yeah.
we should give some thought to that.
Good point. At the April meeting, and select board focused on, we looked at some of the guideline flexibility. We also had Lincoln Heineman, finance director, and Rashid Belchon talking about some of the property tax questions. And we went over some of the alternative ideas for compliance that were mostly fleshed out through some preliminary workshops that staff held, focused on just exploring the sandbox, looking at other ideas besides Harvard Street. You all appointed a committee that to look at other options. They have met, we've met 3 times since then. And there has, Opticos has held their first workshop focused on Harvard Street last week. And as you'll see just below that green arrow, there's several more planned through probably early July. And all of these dates are on our town website as well. I want to go back to just above the green arrow to flag that another update for you is that we have hired Marquee Architecture, who's our preservation architecture consultant for the Harvard Street project. We are hiring them to create design standards specifically for Brookline Village National Historic District. This is an important side effort, whether or not the town decides to do anything. Harvard Street or MBTA, it's important because it's a national register district that as of today has no local protection and doesn't have any standards in place. If a project were to come through, there's nothing for us to specifically rely on. So we are thrilled that that is launched, and that is also moving in parallel. And then let's see, June and July will be again meeting more with the select board appointing committee, looking at continuing to look at different options. We are already testing one idea that the committee has been talking about, which is possibly being able to theoretically comply with the minimum number that we need to just with our multi-family districts. The committee has also flagged many concerns about that, including the idea that because the districts are largely built out, we would see very few units of housing actually built. On the other hand, it's good for us to explore this and understand how it goes to the model so that we could, if we want to, rely on that as a model in combination with other ideas. So we'll see where that goes. Another concern about the M districts or any other districts across a broad geography is that when we allow things as of right, then we obviously also have very little control unless we have those standards well defined. And so on June 3rd, the committee will be doing a site walk in the multifamily districts. We've flagged several example properties where, although they are few and far between, there's a dozen or so properties as examples that are currently below the dimensional allowance of M districts. And if we change that to as of right, we'll have a better sense of what impacts there might be for those different neighborhoods. So the first workshop last week, we had more than 60 people attend, which was wonderful. With Opticos, we're going to be continuing that for the next couple of weeks. But tonight we wanted to, again, kind of take a deep breath, start at the beginning about what is form-based code, how are we using Opticos to look at form-based code specifically for Harvard Street, and then go from there. So I will stop and turn it over to Jennifer Settle, Opticos, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time here tonight. We're really excited to be here. Today I'm going to spend the majority of our time reviewing our approach to Harvard Street, highlighting some of the engagement thus far, and then really diving into what are the benefits and components of form-based codes, including some recent examples that our office has worked on. First, I want to acknowledge, of course, why we are here. We're really here to support staff to complete the zoning update that provides that by right zoning that meets the MBTA state mandate. Perhaps even more important, right? We are utilizing a form-based zoning approach that can really better ensure quality outcomes and objective design standards that reinforce the character of Harvard Street. This zoning will be in alignment with the policy goals that were established by your resolutions. So while a form-based approach is focused predominantly on the physical design and development standards, we believe that it's the best mechanism for delivering on these policy goals thoughtfully. And we are really passionate about creating zoning that leads to more equitable and more sustainable outcomes. Our goals for the project are really to provide that enforceable design standard that maintains that Main Street character of Harvard Street, and really better protects the existing pedestrian environment as well as the existing housing stock that you have. We'll show you a few examples of how this works compared to your current zoning. But first, I want to walk you through our approach, right? As Kara mentioned, our work is really building upon this extensive analysis and outreach that has been done by staff so far. I want to say it's one of the most detailed and setting us up for success that we've seen. We've done this all over the country, and the work that's been done to set this up successfully is really amazing. So I just want to applaud that. But we did start our engagement with community members and have several more workshops just even next week. We know it's hugely important that the zoning aligns with the desires and the concerns of those living in and around Harvard Street, while also balancing that need to provide new housing opportunities. In order to better facilitate those discussions and really understand the various conditions that exist along Harvard Street, the project area was split into 7 sub-study areas, right? Our analysis really focuses on understanding what are those primary ingredients for those different areas that exist or are desired along the corridor. So this becomes the starting point for creating a set of zoning districts that each have an intended form. And it allows us to really dial into the ingredients that people love and value about their neighborhood. So that was sort of the focus of our first engagement, right? So in the first meeting with 2 of the sub areas, we heard residents through both a visual survey as well as a virtual workshop, where participants voiced their preferences and their concerns for those different ingredients, you know, including a discussion of the design and form characteristics that they wanted to see maintained within their sub area. These were some of the favorite photos from the visual preference survey. Not surprising, but we want to make sure you acknowledge that much of the commentary we've heard refers to how the building interacts with the street or the sidewalk, right? What we call the public realm, as well as comments about how the building look and feel, things like materials, shop front, massing, right? These are aspects that need to be addressed in the zoning code, and it's really the reason why a form-based approach is necessary. I'll get into it a little bit more, but conventional zoning, the zoning that you have now, does not deal very well with the design of the buildings, and definitely doesn't deal very well with how the building interacts with the public realm, right? So you do not currently have the tools to enforce that good design standards. And I think one of the most important things, I'll end on in terms of the public engagement, is the best comment we've heard was from members who said, I feel more optimistic. I feel more reassured and more hopeful that the form-based code can deliver and meet the expectations of MBTA, but also deliver quality outcomes that the residents can get behind. We hope that continues, and we certainly are going to do our best to align those two tasks. Alongside that engagement, our technical work for Megan and I really starts with an understanding of your existing zoning. Across the corridor, the existing zoning is varied with both business districts, local and general, as well as residential multifamily districts. So we take a really nitty-gritty close look at the existing zoning to understand what are the standards guiding development today, and do they really reflect both the existing conditions and the desired outcomes. What we find are a lot of barriers that are preventing good outcomes. Standards that are really inconsistent with the existing context, regulations that are giving you unpredictable outcomes, and restrictions that are limiting the potential infill of the potential for infill or in underutilized lots. So in order to really understand those barriers and the potential solutions, our approach includes lot studies. This is from a different community, but these graphically test or will test your zoning standards on existing lot sizes. So we really try to understand what the code is currently encouraging to be built once you meet all the required regulations for buildable envelope, open space, and parking. And then we start to test different development scenarios that better align with those policy and project goals that we heard earlier. And from there, we can start to reverse engineer the standards. And this method really gives you that predictable outcomes, or that more predictable range. So that testing is really our next step in the process. We got it's always helpful to be on the ground to get a feel for the corridor, even though we've already gotten this really great micro scale analysis. But in mid-June, we'll present and discuss those site studies with the community to make sure that the standards that we're considering align with the desires for each sub area. And then in mid-July, we expect to have a public draft with a review period for comment, all so that we can have that final adoption by the end of the year. So let's dive into a little bit more about what form-based codes are and the components. This type of zoning provides objective standards that better protect and enhance that really great urbanism and architecture that you already have, right? This mandate is saying your zoning needs to potentially support more housing. And we want your regulations to give you the clarity of what that could look like, right? And help guide where and how new development might make sense. It seems really obvious that your zoning should carefully consider the built environment and those built outcomes of your town. So why would we need to discuss a new kind of tool, right? But unfortunately, we know all too well, anyone who maybe has read a zoning code from front to back knows too well, that isn't the case, right? Conventional zoning focuses predominantly on use and metrics that haven't done a very good job of giving us predictable outcomes that really support walkable, thriving environments that we love, like Harvard Street. So how do form-based codes give you the better outcomes, right, that align with the character of a place like Harvard Street? We focus on building form and supporting a mix of housing and uses of all kinds, right? We pay particular attention to the public realm, how that face of the building interacts with the sidewalk, and how buildings fit within their context, right? This includes how new construction could deliver a design that enhances Harvard Street, and how it can transition into the surrounding neighborhood and how it sort of jives with the existing context. We really want your code to be proactive in codifying the desired outcomes that you want to see. So to start, this is always a fun part, I want to highlight some of the tools that you currently use, right? The primary one that you use to address the mass of a building is called FAR, right? Floor area ratio. The common performance metric that you use to determine the development potential of a site, right? So it takes the gross floor area of all the buildings on a site and divides it by the lot area. The problem is both of these massings that you see here have the same FAR. In this case, it's 3, right? This type of metric really encourages developers to simply max out the FAR. And you end up getting really boxy buildings with little variation in massing, and really unpredictable outcomes, right? So to mitigate that, we try to layer on things like height limits. This building along Harvard Street might meet the FAR and height requirements, but it still isn't giving us really great design outcomes, right? Your current zoning, the second major barrier, is that it doesn't give any control of what happens at the street level, right? So it might say we want commercial use on the ground floor, but it doesn't really go beyond that to say how that should look or how it should interact with the street. The last tool your zoning currently uses that I'll highlight are the setbacks, right? It's at the minimum setback, but again, it doesn't give you very clear outcomes. So both of these buildings meet your current minimum setback. The takeaway is really that your current standards put your planning board and your staff, right, in a precarious position of trying to articulate why one of these buildings feels more like Harvard Street and why the other doesn't, right? Even though they both meet the letter of the law. So if those tools aren't working, we want to look at the components of the form-based code that start to give you more prescriptive design and development standards. First, I'll go through those in more detail. The regulating plan assigns the zoning districts and various standards to parcels within the project area. This will essentially replace your zoning map, but it goes beyond conventional zoning to really identify that intended physical character that reflects the community's vision and the context around it. The next section is really the meat of the development standards, the building form section. In this case, it goes beyond the building height and that buildable envelope that's set by the setbacks. And it really starts to articulate the scale and the massing of the building that are more compatible with the existing context. So some of the standards you see in the building form standards are about how it relates to its own lot, how it relates to lot size that it's on, both in size and placement. It looks at height, including how a building would transition based on what it's adjacent to. It also regulates things like where parking should be located on a site, right? Together, these provide variety in the built form while also encouraging more physical compatibility. The next section that's really critical to include are frontage type standards that help address that public realm, how it relates to the street and sidewalk. So we can't regulate the public realm necessarily, but we can regulate how the building faces the street and interacts with the street. It's really critical. This is really one of the critical tools of how we can incentivize that active ground floor use. Again, this is very different than conventional zoning, right? Which is really subjective or dependent on subjective architectural decisions. Even if a building might come in and meet the building setbacks and the existing height standards. The form-based zoning for Harvard Street will also include architectural massing and style regulations, right? Which gives you objective standards for the facade composition. It addresses historic adjacencies, as well as fenestration, right? The windows and openings, the composition of how those work, how much transparency a building might need. Really important tools for a place like Harvard Street. In addition, with the form-based code, you'll see components that are similar to your existing ordinance, right? Form-based also includes supplemental standards for site plan review, as well as landscaping, screening, and the design of parking areas. And finally, right, even though it's subordinate to that form and those development standards, it includes regulations for use. And so we'll be working closely with town staff to align this and help simplify and understand the uses that are appropriate even under the MBTA mandate. Form-based codes that incorporate these components are becoming more and more common, right? We've got a really good example from Somerville, not too far away. And so we want to quickly highlight 2 recent codes that give us some picture of how these types of zoning are producing better outcomes. than their previously conventional code. So in Davis, California, we did an update to their zoning for their downtown. The goal here was really to produce clear, concise documentation that provided standards for building massing, articulation, and frontages, with particular attention in this case to civic spaces and to where parking and how signage worked on the street.
Can you go back to slide?
Yeah, this one or the one before?
There we go.
This one?
That's it. Just let us take a quick look at that. Yes. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Similar to Harbor Street, I think there was a concern for understanding how new infill could be regulated for more predictable results. So that scale might be different. Certainly the character is different, but the focus is really on how can your downtown give you predictable results for new infill. So this particular code included a Main Street medium and a Main Street large district that set different thresholds for appropriate infill, right? And so it distinguished where a medium-sized Main Street and a large-sized Main Street might be more appropriate. It also included neighborhood zones to really address the needs of the area that were supporting the Main Street, but were predominantly residential only. The next code I'll note is another downtown code for a town called San Rafael. The critical piece of this code that's similar, I think, to Harvard Street is that it established this visual hierarchy that reinforced the built character of their downtown's really eclectic neighborhoods. And it shaped new development to be sensitive to the existing urban fabric by really looking at building size and that facade zone regulation as well as frontage standards. In this case, we also did architectural massing and facade standards that were really aimed at protecting the downtown's historic resources. And again, being really sensitive to those adjacent residential neighborhoods. This code capitalized on transit risk locations to create new housing, but it calibrated those opportunity sites to enrich the built environment that existed in San Rafael, right? And really focused those efforts on some of those nodes. And then on the other in between, really maintaining the existing character. We've done codes for both large and small towns, both urban and rural places, right? So while those appropriate styles and scales, right, change, the goal is really to produce better built outcomes that reinforce a walkable human scale that we know is really critical to maintaining the success of our neighborhood main streets. So with that, thank you for your time. These are, again, our next steps to really focus on continuing those public engagement and then producing the public draft so that we can meet that final timeline for adoption. So I think we have time for a few questions now. I'm happy to go back to any of this.
I first thank you for the presentation. It was very informative and helpful. Are we going to get a copy of it? That'd be great. Yeah. So I had a couple of questions. The first is related to the workshops that you're doing. How are you determining who's invited? Are these town-wide workshops? Are they more geared towards the neighborhood?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I answer that. Thank you, Mr. Warren. I'm Maria Morelli, Senior Planner.
It's nice to meet you first.
Yes, it's nice to meet you as well. The way we're phasing it, there are 3 phases, and they are chunking Harvard Street into 3 segments. We're sending out postcards to Harvard Street property owners and residents, and then abutters within 600 feet of the Harvard Street parcels. We're also communicating with the town meeting members in those precincts.
Okay, and I assume, does that include building owners and?
Yes, absolutely.
And the commercial operators?
Yes, we're
Okay,
spending a
that's,
lot of time.
that's
talking to
great. Thank
property
you so
owners.
much. The second question I had is an experience. Have you had an experience with other communities where I know that we can incentivize use based on design? So for example, first floor, height, windows interacting with the streetscape. Have you ever been involved in encouraging certain types of use? So as we start to redesign and build neighborhoods, there's a great opportunity to incentivize, build into the code, different types of use. Grocery stores, right? Butchers.
Yeah.
You understand where I'm going. Has that been done before? How would you do that?
Yeah, both Megan and I and our colleagues have background in architecture most of us have also worked, not only with public sector clients, but with private sector developers. And we really understand, the ins and outs of both construction types, right? And how buildings need to work with different uses. And the advantage of that is that we can kind of see down the road of what a building really needs to function successfully and to be feasible for a developer to build. And I think that helps us guide these form regulations. And you sort of spoke to it. I think the main way to incentivize those uses are to set up a building that functions for those uses properly. And that includes things like the ground floor height, right? It includes things for, if you're correlating buildings to lot size that can facilitate, for example, we've done it where, allowing certain uses towards footprints of lots. This is why we calibrate the zoning by lot size, that can support podium buildings, right? A 4/1 construction. We know what developers are gonna go towards that site. And so we can turn the dials up and down to incentivize different uses. But it really, the most effective way we found is through those form controls and incentives to give
So I guess
by right zoning.
So I'm not sure if you answered my question,
Okay, sorry, yeah.
which is okay, so I think it's a hard question.
It is.
So we have neighborhoods
Yeah.
that are behind our commercial corridors, right? And our commercial districts, we have L districts, we have G districts. The L districts are the local businesses, they're meant to serve the neighborhood,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so there's a grocery store, there may be a pharmacy, there might be a dry cleaner. I live behind a business district it's starting to turn into just restaurant row, right? We've lost a lot of the core businesses that service the neighborhood, and now it's becoming a destination, which is, I'm happy to have the business. But in order to create 15-minute neighborhoods, you need to have a variety of services, commercial services, and it's not clear to me how we get those.
Good morning. If I could just address that, we had, basically, we were in sessions all day, and we were incorporating different divisions in the work that we're doing with Opticos. And one key player is, the economic development, long-term planning division. And so what Victor Panang and Will Dorfman are looking at, really understanding where uses are allowed, where they're prohibited, and where they can be encouraged. So we were spending a lot of time looking at the uses table. So there might be some districts that are zoned local business where you could not put an urban market. Because an urban market might be looking at a 15,000 square foot minimum for a store, but we would count the store at 5,000 in our zoning. So there's some practical issues like
By
that.
size, so you can do it.
So we can do it through size, and you want to protect like artist studios, or maybe places where you're having like antique repairs. Those are small businesses where you want to protect those small sizes, and they might be zoned for like 10,000 square feet.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's a helpful answer. And then my last question has to do with these other options that I know there's another committee, when I say potential options. How does this group, Karen, interact with that? Because you're gonna have a similar issue. If there's different options, I assume you still want to have workshops and potentially testing. Is that part of this contract or is that a separate?
No, this contract is for Harvard Street.
Just Harvard Street?
Just Harvard Street.
Okay,
That does not mean that we can't be smart people and say, hey, if we move forward with some combined, select board, that's why we come to you monthly. If we decide to move forward with some combined piece of, maybe it's just for the sake of today, maybe it's 3 stories on Harvard Street, or 4 stories on Harvard Street. So we need more units to make up that number. So we then lean on our M districts, knowing that we're not going to get this quality across all the neighborhoods of Brookline, but that we might feel okay about using the M districts as a buffer, lifting some of the design work that's been done by Opticos, where the select board committee feels like that, certain solutions that are developed could also be applied to some other neighborhoods and help us get.
can you?
Okay, Miriam has her hand up. If I can ask a quick question and get a quick answer.
Yes.
You talked about butters 600 feet from Brookline Village. I've always been concerned about us excluding, for example, public housing development on High Street as well as Village Way. and of course, the Brook House and other areas. Could you make sure that
Yes,
those abutters, I
yes.
think are beyond two
I've
hundred
been
feet?
having meetings with some members of the Brookline Housing Authority about Harvard Street and also continuing sidewalks with different constituency groups.
Okay, thank you. Miriam?
Yeah, great, thank you. So thank you so much for this. And yeah, I assume you guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for this, very helpful. My biggest concern is that I don't want us to be doing the minimum. I know this is not the popular discussion, but to me, this is an opportunity for us to do the minimum and then some. And I think, Kara, you remember, I brought this up the very first time you presented to us about this, the MBTCA Communities Act. This is really like, what can we do? So I was a little concerned early on when we were talking about the commission, and it just seemed like we're doing just what we need to do. And I want us to do more than that. And so I just hope you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Miriam, are you talking about the minimum for Harvard Street, that Harvard Street is paying lip service to MBTA?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm talking about.
That's actually the opposite, because Harvard Street was chosen because there is at least half the lots. There are about 120 parcels on Harvard Street. Half of them are underutilized, which means the property owners cannot improve their properties. I talk to property owners all the time and been doing that for years. They're frustrated because they cannot improve their properties. The retail might be okay, or they might be suffering. And because the FAR keeps the heights effectively at 18 feet or 28 feet, not the 40 and 45 and 50 feet that they're allowed. So if half those lots are underutilized and we can facilitate they're being improved, of course, that's beyond paying lip service. You can actually see real growth on Harvard Street.
I mean, that's what I want to hear. I want real growth on Harvard Street, but also where else? Like I want us to really utilize this to increase housing in Brookline and not just do what we have to for them. And maybe this is a bigger question than for you, since this is only about Harvard Street. But for me, that's what I hope we get out of this.
Okay, Mike? No, I'm sorry, Karen.
Well, I just wanted to respond to the last part of Marianne's question. So the committee that you all appointed, the charge of that committee was to not just look at theoretical way for us to get the minimum number, but also to at least prove one option that would likely encourage housing development. So because you've set out that charge, the committee has only met 3 times, but they are at each meeting talk about, okay, this in-district idea looks like one that we might want to rely on or lean back on, but they are also we've also had conversations such as larger parcels, including the Brookline Housing Authority in Brookline Village. Other property owners have already said, we're interested in doing something in the future. So the committee is taking that side of work very seriously. And those kind of larger parcels may end up being added to any one of these solutions.
Okay, Mike?
Thank you. Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking here. Thank you.
So, couple things. First of all, a question and then a couple of comments on the presentation. If you don't want. You mentioned that you have a model for a medium-sized development downtown, 4 stories, whatever. But when you have multiple forms, one of the things is you don't want all of those look exactly alike, no matter how
Yeah.
beautiful they may be. So you provide some multiple forms that are as alternatives.
Yeah, and part of the process of testing is to really understand what that appropriate range. We love variety. Harvard Street has variety,
Yeah,
we've documented it, right?
Yeah.
What's that appropriate range?
Yeah.
To provide both flexibility and diversity, but also predictable results that are within the scale. So yes, we allow.
A comment for Kara and Maria is, you may be doing this, but when you mentioned property owners and households and so forth, it's really important for tenants.
Yeah.
And
They are.
very important, especially this. The second thing is,
So I've been, every time that I've communicated with Kara, Maria about this, I'm very much a fan, very much. I've said, please show examples of form-based zoning early. So you have Davis and San Rafael as examples in there, but it takes a while to get them. And there's this, I was a consultant for 30 years, and I know there's an enormous tendency to talk about all the things you've done up until the point that you get to the meat of the topic. All the things you've done, honestly, don't matter. It's what you're going to deliver to the client that the client wants to see. And so please put those in earlier in the presentation. And you want people who don't have the foggiest idea about what's this form-based zoning all about. You want to show them a picture, not a list of things that you've done.
Got it.
Okay?
Yeah, noted. That's
Okay. One time I had an engagement with Polaroid. Sent them like, I don't know, a dozen slides or something for a relatively short thing. And the person came back and said, well, we don't, people don't have that patience. We condensed it to one slide. The slide had a time bomb. They had to do something before X, the time bomb went off.
yeah,
Okay? Think about what you would say in one slide about form-based zoning.
fair enough.
The executive summary for those of us with a little time. Miriam, did you have another question? Okay.
No, sorry, I will.
What, the other thing that we're looking for is not just building more housing, right? But how is the process going to ensure, we can't guarantee, but, give us a good chance of that housing having a fighting chance of being affordable as opposed to, because remember, location. Brookline is in high income location. And if we're not, very intentional, any housing that's built is going to be what we're calling luxury housing.
Mr. Green, I'm glad you asked that question, because one thing that I'm really passionate about is ensuring that your current robust inclusionary zoning policy under section 408 in the zoning bylaw actually gets applied. And, if you don't build any housing, 15% times 0 is 0.
Yeah.
But what will happen is that any residential project on Harvard Street will indeed have 15% affordable housing on site. And that will really ensure that we can integrate diversity and have mixed income projects all throughout Harvard Street neighborhoods.
But inclusionary zoning does have limitations.
It does.
And one of the problems I think we're seeing in Brookline is the sale and demolition of 2 and 3 family buildings. Where rents are not cheap, but they're reasonable for middle income people, and replaced with the multi-million-dollar
Correct.
cereal box. So I hope that there's some way of helping prevent that type of process from just overtaking everything else that we do. Because the market's out there, the market's broken, and that's going to be a result unless we're.
So from a staff perspective, we agree, have been saying this quite often.
Yeah, no.
So Maria wrote warrant article 16, for example, which we might get to tonight, that is on the protective side of exactly our 2 and 3 family neighborhoods. We were seeing those tear down there. When asked, we are very nervous about in the next 12 weeks, trying to come up with zoning that does anything that tinkers with the 2 and 3 family neighborhoods for that very reason. One of the reasons why we are interested in Harvard Street is because the residential that is on Harvard Street does not include 2 and 3 family neighborhoods. It includes 3.5 and 4-story residential buildings. And where we're headed with the zoning would likely mean that all of those units would remain in place. So we're aiming for, trying to be very respectful of exactly that concern and not taking down or encouraging the tear down through this single effort of any tear downs of any residential buildings.
And I have a follow-up point
Yeah,
from
of
yours. Okay. Following up on Bernard's 15%. So, there's a couple of challenges with our inclusionary zoning, right? I know we're going to take it down to 10. But even at 10, I'm not sure that given the depth of some of these properties, these parcels and 4 stories, that you're actually going to hit 10 units. Developers have a great ability
to build something to exclude our triggers, right, to avoid our triggers. So that's the first thing. So I think 10 is too high. I think we need to go much lower for inclusionary zoning. And then the second point is the idea that a developer can write a check to the housing trust fund. So even at 10, you know, the developer could say, I don't want to build the affordable units. I'd rather write a check to the housing trust fund. And we're seeing this, and this actually creates luxury buildings. We've seen this across from Meta, the corner of High Street and Route 9. Beautiful building. I think it's an example of what we'd like to see more built in Brookline, but it's an ultra luxury building. There's not a single deed restricted unit in it,
Oh.
which is, no,
I'm sorry.
they
Yes,
were,
right,
yeah,
right,
they
right.
were, yeah, they were. So again, any, as you
So,
said,
yeah.
15% of students zero, but 15% of writing a check to the housing trust fund is housing delay.
We agree. That was a big point that we made in the Harvard Street study, that we wanted to see affordable housing on site. I worked in Brookline for about 10 years and I've done big projects exclusively during those 10 years. And because of the land cost on Harvard Street, you're not going to see 10-unit buildings. You really are going to see really 20 units in order to get the return on the investment. That's why I'm thrilled to do this warrant Article 14, because it will ensure that every project that gets built on Harvard Street is going to have affordable on
I
site.
guess my preference would have been to see warrant article. I don't know why we're preempting at this town meeting to bring inclusionary zoning down to 10. Why that wasn't bundled with what we're going to be approving in November when we have a better sense
You
about
won't
what
be
we're
able
doing.
Yeah, you can't have, you can't treat the MBTA communities district differently from your other townwide.
I'm not suggesting that we do. I'm just saying that, you know, we may pass this article at this town meeting, but I'm hoping that we are willing to actually revisit inclusionary zoning as part of what the outcome of our form-based MBTA community act options.
That makes sense.
John,
Excuse me if any of these questions, either of these questions is basically just of historical interest, but not necessarily all that relevant to what we're trying to achieve here. But I'm always intrigued by the fact that form-based zoning assumes that there is in place something that is well worth imitating, well worth modeling. But they didn't have form-based zoning back then, as far as I know, right? From a historical perspective, why did we get imitation-worthy building without having to dictate it? Whereas now we have to dictate buildings in order to get them.
It's a little bit about the we love this question.
I do, go ahead.
Do you want to take it?
No, I mean, we didn't have zoning.
Right.
And we can go down a long, broad road about what zoning did and why it was enacted. And so I won't do that today, but I do think, we lived differently. We were much more comfortable living smaller, and sharing uses, right? And zoning really came about at a time where we were shifting to auto-oriented and separation of uses. And so things got pushed further and further, and so the building forms changed and how we lived and changed. And some of those reasons were good and well intended, and some were not good, right? Some were rooted in discriminatory practices. And so those buildings that we love were predated zoning and also predated building codes. And all those things. And so there's a reality of and a level of craftsmanship and technology that is all shifted, right? And so we have to recognize those changes in our society and our technology and our building industry, and the way we live, but also look at, as you know, architects, what are the pieces that we want and why are they successful and why are they more human scale? And those are things we can replicate. That answer
Is there anywhere right now that is going so far as to suggest that maybe we could turn back the clock to a, zone free, and I don't want to scare people, but zoning free, but obviously within certain, parameters. And kind of leave it up to the planning department to say whether what you're planning for that site is, something we want. And it could be 8 stories, it could be 2, and it could be, with no setbacks, and it could be with dramatic setbacks, and.
Do we want to give Kara and Maria that much power?
I think Mr. Carey has a.
I was gonna say, because it might be, it's a loaded question for the planning department. I think the unfortunate answer to that is that you have an arbitrary and capricious problem. One of the other big things about land is that courts don't like it when you put restrictions on what landowners can and can't do. Zoning is a historic exception to that, that came about during the suburbanization of the states. But if you just say the rule is what the planning committee says goes, then when the planning committee says no, you get sued and they'll say, well, what standards did you apply? And the standard is, did we like that building? And then the court will.
It really comes to constitutional due process that individuals who have the right to enjoy their land, but they also have to know, they have to be able to read the standards by which that land is going to be regulated.
So we are, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I do think I want to note it does come down to an issue about how our policies are equitable, right? We started with this, right? Our zoning is so convoluted and complicated that only the largest developers who have really good lawyers can make sense of it and can pay for variances and pay for a long process, right? We aren't providing really equitable policy. And our work is really about simplifying the rules, the things that everybody can understand and access those same incentives and same regulations fairly, whether it's, a subsidized project or a luxury product, right? That they both have access and to navigate those rules, and that the community has objective design standards to look to and say, oh, that's what we said we wanted, and that's what we got. Right now, we don't know what we could get, and so we're terrified of the possibilities because it could look any which way, right? So it's really about making it easier for staff to administer, and for projects of all kinds that come in.
So the follow-up question I wanted to set up there is, what worries me about form-based zoning is that when I try to sort of compare it to anything we have right now, I immediately I go to 40B projects. And 40B projects are not quite as tightly controlled as other projects, but they do come under the influence of the, planning board and planning department in terms of a lot of suggestions. And suggestions are a lot like what you hear, it should be form-based zoning, modeling, the context, the materials, high but not too high, et cetera, indents and so on. Variations, but the 40B developments that we have are kind of okay. But imagining Harvard Street lined with nothing but 40B developments is scary. And yet I'm hearing we want to go to 4 stories where we're 1 story. And so a lot of them are 4 to 5 to 6 stories. We want to have retail on the ground floor as much as possible. A lot of them, dictate retail on the ground floor, and a lot of the retail space is empty. And everywhere the retail space is empty, it's a lifeless sort of a block. So how do we not end up with Harvard Street lined with 40B projects?
Can I sort of piggyback on that? My concern is that, are we talking about creating another Levittown, for example? Where you have, that type of form.
So,
I mean, I'm sure it's not form-based zoning, or arrest in Virginia.
right, it's not cookie cutter. So I want to make it clear that capping Harvard Street to 4 stories means that wherever we have retail, and if it's successful, it's not going to be worth demolishing that retail to build 4 stories, because property owners will say it. It's already successful enough. 4 stories being without that revenue for 2 years is not going to be worth it. Now, if the town were to, increase the zoning to high rise, 6 stories, there would be the temptation to do that. But we have some sections where the rents are like $90 a square foot. You're not going to be putting up a 4-story building. It will not be worth it. You want a high rise in those areas.
Unless,
It's very personal.
unless someone acquires the company that owns the building and has different priorities. and
No, it's
different-
really economic. It's the
Well,
numbers,
that's what I'm
the
saying.
numbers don't work.
I think the 40B question, I mean, you have to remember that we're right at the threshold, maybe tiny bit above. The threshold of 40B, so, that isn't what I was saying. I was saying pursuing a form-based zoning would and get a result that would resemble. So that was the question, that was why I asked the question about alternative
Yes.
forms within the district.
John,
Okay,
are you talking about quality of the 40Bs? Because we could do a lot better with form-based zoning than what we were able to scramble for. We really had to claw our way to get whatever we got on those 40Bs because the town had no leverage. Here, we're able to specify materials and fenestration
Mhm.
so that you have something that's more in keeping with the traditional, if that's how you want to lean. So there's a lot more control that you can have in the zoning that you absolutely don't have when you're reacting to a 40B.
Paul,
So, question before this zoning. So are we able to, and I think your fenestration example of materials is an important one. Are we able to say that, these are the 3 or 4 or 5 patterns that you can use and you can't, if one is, you can't have to have the same pattern that's next. I'm thinking the back bay. I don't want Brookline to look like the back bay, but the back bay was created before there was zoning, right? Somehow they produced that, right? And there's not a lot of replication, right? It's different. To me, that's form-based zoning. I don't know how you do that, but are we able to actually specify the types of patterns and fenestration and then say that you can't replicate something that's next door to you?
The replicating that's next door to you is harder. But what we do is really look at patterns. We study buildings all the time and the articulation and the composition of those facades. And there's a wild amount of variety in our environments. And that's what makes that variety is what we love about places. It's why we walk, like the places that we love, because it's interesting. And so we've studied and we codify those different patterns. And so our architectural standards do just that. It lays out a page of appropriate patterns and rhythms and says you can do anything within this. And it's a balance. There's no perfect system, right? But it's a balance between allowing flexibility, right? So that you're respecting the cost and giving that variety to architects and developers, but also giving predictability. And so it's really about providing all of those options that are within this appropriate range and then allowing variations within it, and we will get that.
Well, we do, in our zoning, we have distances for businesses. You can't have a business with a certain distance of another business. That's similar. Can you do that with form-based?
yeah, let's wrap this up. We have another item that's gonna take a lot of time on our agenda, but, answer his question, and I think, Mike has a question.
No, I'm pretty much, I have an explanation for Paul. but-
Okay, talking on.
Okay, so you don't need to answer the question. It's a question that if there's a way to build that pattern into our zoning, that I think it solves the problem that is being raised before you.
This is not a public hearing, but Regina wants to ask a question, and I'll allow it.
I do. I'm not an economist, but I did study with Dr. Carl Case, whom you probably know.
We'll stipulate on your expertise, just ask the
I
question.
can't hear.
We'll stipulate on your expertise, just ask the question.
Well, I took a course, did you? It's
Yes.
expert enough for that. And you can't build a affordable housing usually in a 3-story. You have to do a 4-story. You know that's true, right?
Yeah.
So what I think I was hearing, because there's a lot of misinformation that we can keep everything the same. You can't if you're gonna add the affordability component.
Yeah.
Unless you do the micro units, which I thought I was hearing implicit in what you were saying. Is that correct?
We talk a lot about incentivizing smaller units, right? When we talk about affordability or attainability, right? allowing multifamily, allowing more units on the same size parcel. Does, whether it's actually affordable to a certain AMI, that's a tougher conversation, right? That does take some financial crunching, but the baseline of allowing smaller units and allowing them in walkable, transit-rich locations, right? Is a big piece of how you get.
That goes to John Mansfield concern, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting, and you're gonna get us the slides,
Yes.
so, we
And
will study and digest.
I apologize for telling you how to do your business, but,
Well, we're always open to improving and taking advice, so.
I apologize, but I know.
Jay?
No, thank you.
And I just wanted to say, we are gonna follow up with Paul's statement about the same but different.
Yeah, thank you.
So
Yeah.
I just want to be clear about
I
that.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, two of you.
Thank you all. Yeah, appreciate it.
Okay, next, warrant articles. I assume that means warrant article 2.
Warrant Article 2 is kind of subsumed into Warrant Article 7. We don't need to take a vote because we've already taken that vote yesterday. So I think if we move on to Warrant Article 7, if that's all right. Devin, can I share my screen? Oh, I did. That's exciting. I apologize. This is in your packet, but it was a late edition. It's like added like moments before the meeting. We will get you paper copies. This memo to you about how to reconcile the budget. We talked about yesterday. You voted to fully fund 2 different contracts, one from the JLMC, one for the police, one for the fire department. And we talked about how to cover both the retro pay in one-time funds and the ongoing expense. And we indicated that we had a solution on the retro pay. But in talking to you about whether to approve whether to approve the fire contract, there was the question of how to fund it. And so you gave direction to us in executive session. That direction was to avoid permanent position cuts and retain all promised override restorations and new programs. And find a way to balance the budget with those 2 constraints. We think we have that. We think we have that in a way that works for FY24 and is going to, I think, require us in November, December to have some, tough conversations as part of your potentially tough conversations as part of your budget summit about how these priorities fit into your long-term planning. But in terms of the immediate term, for the purposes of this town meeting, funding this and ensuring that we have a balanced budget, this is the kind of these are the items that we've identified. So as we discussed, right, the one-time funding will be from the collective bargaining reserve fund and unused portions of certain ARPA accounts. We'll get a vote to you on that for next week. We want to get the specific balances of the 2 ARPA accounts we want to use from, so that there's a vote in front of you on that. And again, that's for projects that have come in under budget. And the 2 projects there are the utility repayment project and the what we call the CARES Act continuation budget. Basically, the budget for projects that we were worried that we wouldn't get reimbursed for with prior federal sources of funds. It turns out, thanks to the prudence of this team that was here long before I was, that they were very good at getting the money reimbursed and declared appropriate use. So we need less of that money than we thought we would. So that's a positive outcome. That covers your one-time expenses. For ongoing expenses, we have about $1 million, a little over $1 million to address in fiscal year 24. Our recommendation to you is modifications to certain sources of money and departmental budgets that will allow you to balance the budget for this year. State aid, as Mariah said in her comment, when we discussed at the town school partnership on May 15th, there's currently a discrepancy between the governor's budget, which is our projection source, and the Senate Ways and Means for how much state aid Brookline will receive. There's an additional about $295,000 discrepancy there. Using that towards the collective bargaining balance would go a long way towards addressing that $1 million hole. It does require taking that money, quote unquote, above the line. which is to say ordinarily that money would go through the town school split. We would say in this instance that this as a an item not to be repeated, but as a matter of exigency in addressing these unplanned overages. This year, that discrepancy would flow through state aid. For group health, we anticipate pretty significant group health savings. This is not set in stone, but we have a conservative projection that indicates that we will get around $400,000 coming out of group health savings. Even though group health costs increase because our plans all change, people drop into programs that actually cost us less, even though the overall cost of all the programs went up. So effectively, because people, our employees went to different plans that cost less, even though the total cost of the group health went up. We went down because of the savings from their switching into different plans. When we budget for things, generally, we don't budget for rolling implementation, right? We say over the course of the year, it's going to cost us X to do this. So for the salary study, the override, what we said was, it's going to cost us this year $315,000. And that really does assume that we start on day one and we are expending this money right away. If we are, which we have to in this instance, rolling this out more gradually, starting with social workers, that's actually going to be before the HR board at the end of this month, and then kind of moving down the list of folks who we know are out of alignment. We recognize savings because we're not making those changes retroactively. We're making them on a prospective basis. So we anticipate realizing about $50,000 in salary savings just from that rollout. The reason why we don't ordinarily budget that way, and I'll get into this in more detail, is because that does limit ultimately then the flexibility to use that funding for free cash later. For the remainder of these are what we call salary savings. And salary savings are either realizing savings now for positions we believe we are not going to fill over the course of this year, or realizing savings from positions where we think that where we have filled the position, but with someone who is in a lower step. For example, if someone departed at step 12 and we hired someone in a new role at step 3, we reckon we got some savings there. We tend to not realize that. We put that into free cash at the end of the year, and or that lives in the departmental budget, so that there is some flexibility on the departmental side to do that kind of thing. So in a couple of cases, we have those circumstances. Those tend to be one-off events that we can't kind of control for. But in a couple of instances, we have those savings that we're going to realize here. And the others are for, in the same way that advisory balanced their initial budget by claiming salary savings on the police side. We have identified $100,000 in the police department, $50,000 in the building department, $30,000 in the assessor's office, and $50,000 across 2 departments of public works, $40,000 in parks, and $10,000 in transportation for salary savings there. And then ODICR, the rolling implementation of the language access program, similarly to the rolling implementation of the salary study, will save us, we estimate approximately $30,000. So with all of that, that gets you $1,007,428, and that balances the budget.
Congratulations. Rolling implementation means delay, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one question, it seems kind of strange that employees are moving into health plans that are cheaper.
They're getting, it's not necessarily that doesn't mean that the quality of service is any less. It just means that group are as members of the kind of group health consortium, the consortium is taxed with exactly these issues, knowing that healthcare costs are going up, going back out to bid and saying, who's going to give us, the same quality of service, albeit for somewhat less. And so effectively, we used to have.
So it's top sort of way.
Right, top sort of way.
Very expensive.
Right.
And the plans that remain are less expensive than one.
Right. They're not one-to-one, but they provide a similar level of service, significantly less cost.
Got it.
So, I just want to be clear, right, like I said, this strategy is inherently a temporary one, and it's outside of the typical way we tend to budget. Boston is very, Melissa will tell you coming out of that space, Boston is very big into, putting salary savings up front and saying this all comes back to the center at the end, and that's how we deal with it. We know we're not filling these positions, so we're very clear on what the budget means. In Brookline, historically, we've given department heads more leeway. I think as we've discussed, And, you know, one of the things that I discussed in, when I first got here in terms of, you know, talking through, moving through this year's budget as kind of the last of the maintenance budgets, is that we need to, you know, as part of this, take a look at when we can potentially recognize savings in the departmental budgets. Rather than saying, you know, there's often, you know, people say, well, you know, do things for the sake of doing it, you know, because we've always done them that way. Sometimes there's very good reasons for that, but sometimes it's just inertia. And we really need to get the tires on some of these projects and make sure that we are not leaving money on the table. So that's a big effort on that end.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
So just appreciate that this looks very good, actually. And it conforms to what we talked about, and I'm really very pleased that we're not gonna have to chop into what we promised people in the override. But it's pretty likely that it's gonna have an effect on free cash at the end of the year.
Significant.
Yeah.
And we should not expect a bumper year of free cash like last year. We're gonna have much less to work with, and we're likely not gonna, you know, we're gonna have less to play around with in November. We're gonna, you know, historically, there's an expectation in the community that, oh, you know, we're gonna have significant revenue overages. The state's view is that the party is over. Revenue is gonna drop, and it's gonna drop everywhere.
State revenue.
Yeah, well, state revenue is gonna drop, but local revenue, the state thinks that the economic conditions are flashing red across the board.
So
So,
revenue is depending on the real estate taxes.
yes, well, I also, local revenue is not just on real estate taxes, it's depending on things like,
Okay, local receipts.
local receipts.
Permanent.
Yeah, building permits, yeah. The reason why we had such a bumper year in free cash was the utility payoff and a big permit that came.
Yeah.
We may not have that this year.
And free cash is such a terrible term, because it's
Yes.
really not free. It
Well,
means we have to do something.
It's neither free nor cash.
Yeah. You know, it's a missed opportunity, free cash.
Well, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's money that you,
We intentionally try and generate it to support our CIP.
yeah, it's.
So we're acknowledging that we're likely going to generate less, and that the CIP will be the bear the burden of these.
Right, that's what I'm thinking, is
Yeah.
that the capital improvements budget will be hit the hardest, because that's where free cash comes out.
Things are
At the
getting
end of
tight.
the water bill, yeah.
Things are getting tight.
Okay,
So I have vote language for you if you want, so you could send this forward to advisory for their consideration next Tuesday, so it can be ready to vote on Wednesday. And it will be voted to propose a recommendation to vote favorable action on an amendment to warrant article 7 in the form and substance conveyed in the table attached to the union contract budget reconciliation memorandum dated May 24th, 2023. Those tables are in the packet. It just reflects, you know, across the full budget, the changes made here in this memo.
okay, and we'll be dealing with that piece of warrant article 7, what was it?
Wednesday.
31st?
We're gonna put together a supplement that will go out at the end of the week, that will have, that the advisory committee will be able to use. when they go on that.
All right,
Okay. anything? Yeah.
Thursday.
So, can you address the question raised by Mariah in the public comments?
Which question, sorry?
She, I think is saying, signaling that the school committee is not gonna be happy with the approach towards, the additional revenue.
Right, so I think what she said, and you know, is and similar to the remarks made at Town School Partnership on the 15th, which is, if we're doing this, then this process needs to be codified as part of the reevaluation of the revenue split. It can't just be a reactive thing. Going forward, there need to be clear rules on when either the schools or the town get to do this.
yeah, we talked about that ourselves, we said, okay, we have to put in place a set of standards, it's not when something goes, is scooped above the line, as we've been saying.
Okay, anything else?
No, let's have.
Okay.
I want to thank, so
Did they vote? I didn't get.
no, they haven't voted yet. I wanted to thank Charlie and Melissa for, you know, just pulling, you know,
Thank you.
wherever possible to make this happen. Thank you.
But wait, we're voting tonight on that one.
On this, yeah. So the language again is to propose.
And that's gonna be given to advisors.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So the language is to propose a recommendation of a vote of favorable action on an amendment to warrant article 7 in the form and substance conveyed in the table attached to the union contract budget reconciliation memorandum dated May 24th, 2023.
Okay, for the record, I said that, and I move approval And please indicate by saying aye. John?
Aye.
Miriam?
Aye.
Mike?
Aye.
Paul?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Okay. That's it.
And we have,
Oh, I'm sorry. We have commissioner.
you actually have one more warrant article. I wanted to make sure that we covered it, because we put Article 15 on. Last night, remember, I talked about the issue of the building code, the stretch code, or the 10 towns.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Again, then it's still should be coming shortly. Unfortunately, he's still recovering from surgery, but I want to make sure that he has an opportunity to speak. But I have spoken to him and Kara Bruton this afternoon. The current recommendation from staff is that you do not alter the language. The language that's currently before you that you voted favorable action on is the modified language that was developed in consultation with advisory. The reason for that is that DOER has not finalized its proposed money. It's only issued proposed language for the community's consideration.
Has advisory dealt with this issue yet?
No, they'll deal with it next Tuesday. But the recommendation on that is stay the course, stay with the modified language and.
Chad, I'm not sure if that's correct anymore.
Oh, is it? Okay. Kara, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were still here. I'm very glad you were. Sorry, it's
Yeah,
my fault.
or no, your conclusion is still the same.
Okay.
I thought I heard the phrase that the state hasn't finalized their guidance.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that's what you said, but that was what I was flagging. They have finalized their guidance language. However, here's the that he's going to talk to you about some of the concerns that we all share about that recently released guidance language and how it squares with the existing building code. So we want what you've already voted to pass town meeting. We are working with other communities that have similar differences from the language that was released last week. We'll work through it. It's very likely we'll come back in the fall along with other communities for some adjustments. But Chad, I think you wanted to mostly have Dan explain the confusion of the state code.
Before we have Dan speak, because you just said something that's different than what he said. So I heard Chaz say, we want to revert back to the original language. And the language that we adopted was a modified language that dealt with, this multifamily 51% trigger. And that's where we want to stay. We want to stay where it is, because we have big problems if we.
Okay, the only difference is they do have the guidance out, but we're not ready to adjust.
Yes, we're pretty aware that the language that hopefully town meeting will pass does not square completely with some of the definitions that was released last week. We're not panicking. We're moving forward with other communities. We may have to come back in the fall to adjust, but I think it.
Okay, I think Dan is on the.
Yeah, Dan, if you want to just chime in on this, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Bennett, Building Commissioner. So I've been involved in the 3 different versions, I guess, what you would say with respect to this model code. The original definition referred us back to 225 CMR 22 and 23. Our interpretation on that created some concern with the full advisory committee in the way that it impacted or could impact condominiums, and that would be low-rise condos, and a low-rise condo with 6 units. If they renovated more than 50% of their specific unit, it was our interpretation that that unit would have to come into full compliance with the energy code. That became problematic for the advisory. We stepped back with the subcommittee and planning staff, Paul Campbell and myself, and we worked up a new definition, or a new definition was proposed. That definition, which is what I think is still on the table, changes the major renovation to 50%. You have to do renovate more than 50% of the aggregate area of the entire building. So in a condo like that, a 6-unit condo or a high rise, that wouldn't get triggered. The most recent model code, definition that came out by DOER a little late in the game because 2 or 3 communities, maybe 4, have already adopted definitions, their own, very similar to what we've done, and are going to move forward. So I think at this point, between planning staff, Tom Barrasso, Jonathan Simpson, and maybe even the subcommittee, I don't recall how some of these decisions were made. We felt that it was best to just stick with the definition we have now, which is the second definition. It's the town, we'll call it the town-made, definition. That would be a 50% trigger of the work area of the aggregate of the building area. So I hope that kind of explains it for you. And it certainly makes it easier for us to some degree, because there's not a whole bunch of what ifs and how fors. And the new definition was the DOER definition had a lot of inconsistencies with the stretch code definition. They took out an or and added an and they limited a lot of this to 1,000 square feet. And there were some things that, while I said I don't think it would change my opinion on our homemade definition versus theirs. It might be too late in the game to go and change this, and it might create havoc at town meeting.
So the guidance is stick with what we have already approved. We don't need to reconsider. Yes, definitely.
Okay, any other questions, John?
Yes, it falls on me to present the select board's recommendation, which I intended would end with as follows, and then you will find in the general combined reports, the language that we are recommending in the vote. Is that still true, or is there? Okay.
Okay.
And just one more thing too. I'm not sure. There is a waiver provision in there that I can waive, some of these requirements, and then someone can appeal it to the select board. I'm not sure if you guys were notified of that, and I did ask. But so that's a process that I think communities wanted to have, because nobody's sure right now what the appeal process is for the energy code, whether it goes to DOER or if it goes to BBRS. So for the short term, we'll do it internally and then see where the larger picture, plays out.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to,
Thanks, Dan.
thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for correcting me.
So next item is boards and commissions. We have one applicant. Is that an interview or?
So you have 2 applicants who interviewed before you over the previous weeks. Carol did reach out to me today. She is not applying for reappointment, so there are now 2 vacancies on the commission for women. You have the opportunity to reappoint 2 members who have applied for reappointment. And I can get that information for you. It should be in your packets. As well as the women who applied. They have both spoken with the chair of the Commission for Women, and she has expressed her support in this case.
Okay, I guess we can defer to that. Pardon?
Miriam, did you have your hand raised?
Well, I did, but I think, so basically we can appoint both the women that we interviewed. And we can reappoint both the people that want to be reappointed. So everybody gets a position.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna vote on that now?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful.
I didn't see that in the packet, so I don't know
What's
what.
in there? So this is Cynthia.
So I'm gonna show you the live version of the packet, which folks following along at home can find online. When I click on Commission for Women down here, we have the summary. Which shows you the women who are coming up for reappointment, as well as the 2 vacancies. And then here. want to take the new appointments first.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Okay, so that
So-
is Cynthia Arnfeld and Julia Kazan, and those would be 3-year terms.
Okay, I move approval of the appointment of Cynthia Armstead, Arnfeld,
Arnfeld.
and Julia Kazan to the Commission for Women. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. John,
Aye.
Miriam,
Aye.
Mike,
Aye.
Paul,
Aye.
chair votes aye. And then the reappointments are,
Aileen Lee
oh, I like Aileen Lee.
and Lucy G.
Okay, I move approval for a reappointment to the Commission for Women of Aileen
Lee.
so I think Lee, okay, and Cynthia G. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Pardon?
Lucy G.
Oh, I'm sorry. Lucy G. Indicate by saying aye. John,
Aye.
Miriam,
Aye.
Mike,
Aye.
Paul,
Aye.
chair votes aye. Okay, that ends the meeting.
All right. I'll be late again to town meeting, but I'll see you there as soon as I can get there.
Okay.